during her break from her PhD studies at San Diego State University in June of 2024. 29-year-old Nicole Verti traveled to Pittsburgh to visit her close friend, Savannah Roberts, who had recently become a mother to twin boys named Ari and Leon. During her stay there, Verti alerted Roberts and her husband, Ethan Katz, to an injury on Ari. The couple rushed their son to the hospital while Verti stayed behind and watched his brother. A short while later, Verti called the police and said that Leon had fallen out of a bouncing chair while she was in another room retrieving a bottle for him. He suffered a fatal skull fracture, which doctors determined was not the result of an accident. Leon died from blunt force trauma, and Verti is now facing charges of homicide, 3 counts of aggravated assault, and 2 counts of child endangerment. She continues to maintain her innocence and is awaiting her next court date from behind bars at a Pittsburgh jail where she remains held without bail. Number 16. Shu Ming Lee. During the summer of 2023, 36-year-old Umar Abdullah and his wife began noticing a strange chemical-like odor in their Tampa Bay apartment, which caused excruciating headaches and an array of other unpleasant symptoms, including shortness of breath, nausea, drowsiness, dizziness, and burning of the eyes. They eventually started losing chunks of hair, and their baby went bald. Suspecting that the noxious smell was coming from outside the apartment, Abdullah hid a camera inside a potted plant near his front door. It wasn't long before the device captured footage of his downstairs neighbor, 36-year-old chemistry PhD student Shu Ming Lee, injecting what looked like a liquid-filled syringe into the crack beneath the front door. In the video, Lee could be seen covering his nose and trying not to inhale the toxic substance. Abdullah and his wife had been neighbors with Lee for about a year and were on pleasant terms at first. After the couple's baby was born, Lee began to complain about the sounds of ordinary, everyday activities, like the toilet flushing in drawers being opened and closed. His sudden anger traumatized the Abdullahs, causing them to walk on eggshells out of a constant fear that even the slightest noise would trigger an outburst. But the couple never imagined that Lee would go as far as trying to poison them until they saw the video, which they promptly turned over to the police. Investigators identified the substance as a dangerous mixture of the opioid painkillers, methadone and hydrocodone, which can easily make someone sick or even kill them, especially if the person has no tolerance to the drugs. Lee pleaded not guilty to battery, aggravated stalking, and dispersing a chemical agent, but was deported to China, which means that he won't have to answer to his charges, but that he'll also probably never be able to return to the US. Number 15. Tye Chi. On a Monday afternoon in August of 2023, a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, entered a laboratory building with a 9mm pistol and opened fire on faculty advisor Zhi Yang, killing him at the scene. Identified by witnesses as 34-year-old Tye Chi, the shooter fled on foot and was located in a nearby residential area 2 hours later. Chi denied owning a gun, but records showed that he had recently bought a pistol and ammunition. The day before Yan's murder, he had gone to a local fire range to practice shooting. He was charged with first-degree murder and carrying a gun on educational property, and was detained without bond for the next 3 months as he underwent 2 mental evaluations. In November of 2023, Chi was found mentally unfit for trial based on the findings of the evaluations, which concluded that he most likely suffered from untreated schizophrenia. According to the judge, he was delusional, suffered from hallucinations, and experienced other symptoms which rendered him incapable of understanding his court proceedings or assisting in his defense. She was committed to a state hospital for treatment and could still face charges in the future if his mental health improves. Number 14. Emmanuel Espinosa. On an April afternoon in 2024, 21-year-old Emmanuel Espinosa dialed 911 and confessed that he had just killed his 46-year-old mother, Elvia, at her Polk County, Florida home. The fourth-year pre-med student who graduated at the top of his high school class and had previously been described as a genius had stabbed Elvia upwards of 70 times, giving her essentially no chance of surviving the attack. Elvia was expecting her son, who had driven to the residence in frostproof from the University of Florida after she asked him to visit, but Emmanuel apparently had other plans based on the doorbell camera footage that showed him entering the home while holding a small knife behind his back. In a news conference announcing the young man's arrest for first-degree murder and evidence tampering, Sheriff Grady Judd described the homicide as one of the most bizarre murders that we've dealt with in a very long time. He said that Emmanuel had no history of mental illness and did not appear to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol after the deadly attack. When asked about why he killed Elvia, he simply stated that he had just been angry and that he hadn't liked his mother in years. Emmanuel refused a public defender and remains held without bond at the Polk County Jail. Number 13. Erin Patterson. A weekly lunch gathering among 5 Australian friends took a horrific turn in July of 2023 when all 4 of 49-year-old Erin Patterson's guests became violently ill after eating her beef Wellington. The attendees included Patterson's former in-laws Don and Gail Patterson, her sister Heather Wilkinson, and Heather's husband Ian. Erin had also invited her ex-husband to the meal at her home in Leongatha, Victoria, but he had skipped out and would soon learn that the decision not to go most likely saved his life. Toxicology reports revealed that the beef Wellington contained death cap mushrooms, an extremely poisonous species responsible for an estimated 90% of mushroom-related fatalities worldwide. It contains toxins that cause the liver and kidneys to shut down, resulting in symptoms like extreme nausea, diarrhea, and in many cases, death. Many sufferers of death cap mushroom poisoning feel unbearably ill before experiencing sudden relief, giving them the false impression that they're getting better. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, their condition deteriorates rapidly. And because the damage that death cap mushrooms do to the human body is irreversible, getting medical treatment quickly can easily mean the difference between life and death. Within a week of the poisoning, 3 out of Patterson's 4 poisoned guests were dead. The sole survivor, Ian Wilkinson, spent 2 months in the hospital fighting for his life before being released with the expectation of a full recovery. Both the police and members of the public suspected Patterson of deliberately poisoning her friends as a lengthy investigation played out. In November of 2023, she was charged with 3 counts of murder and 5 counts of attempted murder. In addition to the beef Wellington incident, she's accused of trying to fatally poison her ex-husband on 4 separate occasions when he became sick after eating food that she had prepared. News of Patterson's arrest shocked her former air traffic control colleagues, who remembered her as highly intelligent and extremely good at her job. She was even entrusted with running airspace despite only working in the field for less than 2 years, and now she is paying the consequences of some arguably unintelligent decisions that could prove to be life-ruining. Patterson pleaded not guilty and continues to maintain her innocence while being held without bail. Number 12. Eric Scott Sills. Early one morning in November of 2016, renowned fertility doctor Eric Scott Sills dialed 911 and reported finding his wife, 45-year-old Suzanne Sills, dead at the bottom of a staircase at the couple's San Clemente, California home. Sills claimed that Susan had fallen down the stairs in a freak accident, but he acted noticeably unemotional during the 911 call after initially speaking to the dispatcher in a frantic tone. When police arrived, they noticed that the placement of Susan's body conflicted with Scott's claim that he had moved her to a flat surface to perform CPR. The body bore injuries that looked more like ligature marks than bruises from falling, and there was blood elsewhere throughout the home, indicating that a struggle had taken place. A year later, the medical examiner concluded that she had been strangled. Her death was classified as a homicide, and the investigation continued without any immediate arrests. Prior to the tragedy, the Sills seemed happy together. They were lovers, best friends and business partners who ran a successful in vitro fertilization practice together. Scott was considered a top expert in his field and often appeared on the talk show The Doctors, while Susan was a skilled businesswoman who ran the office like a well-oiled machine. Following Susan's death, text messages in the Sills phones revealed a toxic and unhealthy relationship that had started to crack beneath the picture-perfect veneer of upper-middle-class success. In one message, Susan said she would never be free and pleaded with Scott to let her leave the marriage. Investigators also discovered that the couple had a history of fighting over money and the amount of alimony Scott paid to his ex-wife. Despite his claim that his marriage was doing well at the time of Susan's death, authorities finally moved forward with a murder case against Scott in 2019, more than 2.5 years after Susan's death. During his trial in 2023, Scott stood by his original story that Susan had tragically lost her footing and fallen down the stairs, while the prosecution accused him of killing his wife in a fit of rage during an argument. The jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Number 11. Henry Lee. Famed forensic scientist Henry C. Lee has worked on some of America's most high-profile criminal cases. He had a nearly flawless reputation until 2019, when the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that he had inaccurately testified in a murder case about a towel having blood on it. Lee's erroneous testimony played a key role in landing a pair of innocent teenagers named Sean Henning and Ralph Birch behind bars for the 1985 murder of a retired truck driver named Everett Carr. The men spent 30 years in prison before their convictions were finally vacated. At the time of Carr's murder, Henning and Birch were drug-addicted thieves who were living out of a stolen car. Despite their questionable lifestyle, they insisted that they weren't killers and argued in court that they couldn't have committed the crime because there was no blood on them or their belongings, despite Carr having been stabbed over 24 times. Lee's claim that there were traces of blood on a bath towel helped to secure a conviction against the teens. In 2008, the towel was retested as part of Henning and Birch's efforts to clear their names. The test proved that there was no blood on the towel, leading to the conclusion that Lee never tested it in the first place. He denied the allegation, insisting he had tested the towel for blood and that he had photos to prove it. Lee also argued that the blood evidence could have degraded over time and was no longer detectable. In July of 2023, 4 years after the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that Lee had erred in his testimony, a federal judge determined that there was no way a photograph could prove that an item had been tested for blood. He concluded that Lee had fabricated the evidence and ruled that the forensic expert could be liable for tens of millions of dollars in damages. In a wrongful conviction lawsuit, Henning and Birch had filed against him, 8 investigators, and the town of Milford. 2 months after the ruling was made, a $25.2 million settlement was negotiated between Henning, Birch, and the Connecticut Attorney General. In 2024, state lawmakers approved the payout, which will provide each of the wrongfully convicted men with $12.6 million. Number 10. Paul Curry. 45-year-old Linda Kincaid met 32-year-old engineer Paul Curry in 1989 while working at a nuclear power plant in Southern California. Paul was a 2-time Jeopardy champion and a member of Mensa, an organization for people who rank within the top 2% of IQ scores. Linda was impressed by his intelligence, and the relationship continued to grow. The couple married in 1992 after 3 years of dating and lived in a house that Linda bought in San Clemente. While their marriage appeared happy on the outside, there were already problems in Linda and Paul's relationship, and things didn't get better after they exchanged their vows. About a month after the wedding, Linda told a friend that Paul was pressuring her to take out a $1 million life insurance policy and that he had no interest in being intimate with her. In July of 1993, Linda suddenly fell ill with severe gastrointestinal symptoms. She was rushed to the hospital where doctors suspected that someone was poisoning her and discovered evidence that her IV had been tampered with. Linda got sick again 5 months later and returned to the emergency room where Paul was banned from entering her room due to the poisoning suspicions. After Linda's release from her second hospital stay, her friends begged her to move out of her and Paul's home. They were extremely worried that Paul was going to kill her, and the police had also grown suspicious. But Linda refused to leave, and in June of 1994, Paul dialed 911 and reported that she wasn't breathing. Linda died from her mystery illness. Toxicology tests showed that she had sleeping pills and an alarmingly high amount of nicotine in her system, despite not being a smoker. Around the same time, Paul's boss discovered that he had lied about having a college degree and fired him from his job. But he probably wasn't too worried about money, since he had just collected $419,000 from Linda's estate. Authorities remained convinced that Linda was murdered, but the case stalled for several years until law enforcement launched a renewed effort to solve it in 2002. 8 years later, prosecutors finally decided to pursue a murder charge against Paul, who was now living in Salina, Kansas with a new wife and working as a building code inspector. The case against Paul was circumstantial but strong. In 2014, more than 20 years after Linda's death, a jury found him guilty of insurance fraud and first-degree murder, with special circumstances for poisoning and murder for financial gain. He received the maximum sentence of life without parole. Number 9. Jeffrey Pine. In May of 2011, 51-year-old Ruth Pine was found murdered in the garage of her Highland Township, Michigan home. She had been bludgeoned and stabbed at least 16 times in what appeared to be a crime of rage. Investigators traced the murder to Ruth's 21-year-old son, Jeffrey Pine, a former star athlete and high school valedictorian who was pursuing a biology degree at the University of Michigan. The community was shocked when the well-liked young man was charged with first-degree murder, and some people even refused to believe that Jeffrey was capable of committing such a horrific crime. According to prosecutors, Jeffrey's relationship with his mother was strained by Ruth's mental health issues and years of abuse that she had inflicted on her son. About a year before the murder, Ruth had been arrested and detained for assaulting Jeffrey, but she managed to avoid criminal charges by agreeing to get treatment and stay on her medication. During Jeffrey's murder trial in 2012, his ex-girlfriend testified that Ruth Pine often assaulted her son and described her as being dangerous when she was off her meds. But there are at least two sides to every story, and Ruth's sister insisted that the deceased victim was not the monster that she was being depicted as in the courtroom. Jeffrey's defense attorneys denied that he had anything to do with Ruth's murder, regardless of her mental state, and claimed that Ruth was killed by strangers in a home invasion gone wrong. With no physical evidence linking Jeffrey to the crime scene, the case was entirely circumstantial. The jury found him guilty of a lesser second-degree murder charge, and he was sentenced to 20 to 60 years in prison with an earliest possible release date in 2031. Number 8. Sergey Savitzky. While stationed at Russia's Bellingshausen Station research base on Antarctica's King George Island in October of 2018, 54-year-old electrical engineer Sergey Savitzky stabbed 52-year-old welder Oleg Belogusov in the chest several times. Belogusov was taken to Chile for medical treatment, and Savitzky was sent back to Russia to face an attempted murder charge. The two colleagues had worked together for about 6 months and had ongoing issues with one another at the time of the stabbing. Accounts about what led up to the attack vary, with one story claiming that Savitzky got mad at Belogusov for giving away the ending of books that he was reading. Others said that Savitzky lost his temper when Belogusov joked about how he should table dance for money. Both narratives agreed on two things: that Savitzky seemed intoxicated and that he appeared to be experiencing an emotional breakdown, leading to speculation that he was suffering from a psychological condition known as winter over syndrome. It results from the effects of the severe isolation that comes with spending an entire winter in the Antarctic, where there's no physical contact with the outside world or between research stations for a 7 to 8 month period. During a court hearing in 2019, Savitzky expressed remorse for his actions and said he was willing to accept a criminal punishment, but Belogusov said that she forgave him and proposed dropping the case altogether, and the judge granted the request. Number 7. George Tripal. After marrying in 1988, Peggy and Pi Carr moved in together on a remote property in Polk County, Florida, with 4 of their children from previous relationships. Their only neighbors were a chemist and computer programmer named George Tripal and his wife Diana, who was an orthopedic surgeon. The Tripals were both Mensa members who rarely socialized outside the group, and it wasn't long before George began to behave in a threatening and intimidating manner toward the Carrs. In October of 1988, the Carrs received a threatening letter telling them that they had 2 weeks to leave the state forever or they would all die. On a previous occasion shortly before that, George Tripal had threatened to kill Peggy's son. Shortly after receiving the letter, Peggy fell, gravely ill with severe nausea, pain in her chest and extremities, a burning sensation throughout her body, and difficulty breathing. Her son and stepson also got sick, and all three of them were admitted to the hospital about a week later. Peggy told the emergency room doctor that she felt like she was on fire, while her stepson described an unbearable tingling sensation in his hands and feet. The two boys spent months in the hospital but survived. But Peggy's condition worsened and she lost all her hair and became unable to speak or open her eyes. She fell into a coma and doctors discovered that she had a highly lethal dose of the element thallium in her system. Her sons and 3 other household members also tested positive for thallium. Peggy died in early 1989 after spending 5 months in the hospital, and state and federal authorities spent the next year investigating the bizarre case. They found thallium in bottles of Coca-Cola at the Carrs' home, making it clear that someone had deliberately poisoned the family. About a year after Peggy's death, the Tripals moved and rented their house out to an undercover sheriff's detective who had spent months posing as a Mensa member and befriending them. Law enforcement searched the property and found a bottle of thallium, which seemed to confirm their suspicions that George was responsible for killing Peggy and making her family sick. In April of 1990, George was indicted on 1 count of first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 7 counts of poisoning food or water, and 1 count of tampering with a consumer product. A jury found him guilty on all counts the following year and recommended the death penalty. More than 30 years later, he remains on death row with no apparent execution date in sight. George is now 75 years old, which means that he may end up dying from old age rather than meeting his fate in an execution chamber. Number 6. Charlene Galo. Charlene Galo grew up in a comfortable middle-class home in Stockton, California. During the 1960s, she was a talented violin player, described by some as a prodigy, and was known to have an IQ of 160. The adults in Galago's life regularly complimented her for being educated and articulate beyond her years, but her behavior turned wayward during her teens when she became promiscuous and began abusing drugs and alcohol. By the time she was 21 years old, she already had 2 failed marriages under her belt. She met her 3rd husband, Gerald Galago, at a poker club in Sacramento in 1977. The couple seemed highly compatible at first, but their relationship began to deteriorate after Gerald caught Charlene cheating on him with a woman. He lost all interest in being intimate with his wife and told her that he would need to take women captive in order to remain satisfied. Charlene agreed to help Gerald find and kidnap victims, and they abducted and killed 10 people in California, Oregon, and Nevada over a 2-year period started in 1978. The Galagos killed their victims in various ways, including by strangulation, blunt force trauma, shooting them and burying them alive. They managed to evade law enforcement until November of 1980, when a witness to their most recent kidnapping took note of their license plate number and gave it to the police. Gerald and Charlene were both charged with kidnapping and murder. They pleaded not guilty, and Charlene managed to negotiate a plea deal which came with a 16-year prison sentence in exchange for her testimony against Gerald. In 1983, Gerald was found guilty of 2 murders in California. He was convicted of another 2 murders in Nevada the following year and was sentenced to death. Charlene was released from prison in 1997 and went on to live a mostly quiet existence away from the spotlight. In an interview with the Reno Gazette-Journal shortly after her release, she described herself as a victim of Gerald rather than a co-conspirator who helped him carry out his crimes. She claimed that she had even tried to save some victims' lives, but many people did not believe that she was as innocent as she acted and that she deserved a much harsher sentence than she received. Gerald passed away from cancer on death row in 2002 at the age of 56. Number 5. Zin Bowman. 42-year-old Yancey Knoll was stopped at a red light on his way home from work in Seattle one evening in 2012 when the driver of a BMW pulled up next to him and shot him in the head 4 times through the car's passenger side window. He died instantly, and the shooter sped off. Known for his easygoing personality, Knoll was well liked and had no enemies, leaving detectives perplexed as they tried to determine whether he was targeted or killed at random. Based on witness descriptions, police issued a public notice in search of a silver BMW convertible with a broken passenger side window, along with a composite sketch of the driver, hoping someone would identify the suspect before he struck again. An anonymous tipster alerted police to Zin Bowman, an engineer and BMW owner who lived just blocks from the crime scene. The 29-year-old bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch, but he seemed like an unlikely murder suspect. Bowman was a literal genius who had gone to college at just 12 years old, owned a successful business, and was married to an attractive dentist. With so much to lose, it made no sense to think that he would execute a complete stranger in cold blood. But the evidence had started pointing toward him, and police brought him and his wife, Jennifer, in for questioning. In the meantime, law enforcement executed a search warrant at the couple's home, which was barely furnished, but contained an arsenal of guns. Bowman refused to talk and was detained on a first-degree murder charge while the investigation continued. A search of his devices revealed a disturbing fascination with death and murder, as well as a training video about shooting through glass, which instantly reminded detectives of the broken window on Bowman's BMW. At this point, it became clear that Bowman most likely murdered Knoll simply for the thrill of it. During his trial in 2014, Bowman took the stand in his own defense, claiming that Knoll had struck him in the head with a wine bottle in a fit of road rage and prompting him to open fire in self-defense. He was completely shocked when the jury found him guilty, and even said at his sentencing hearing that he was disappointed that they didn't believe him. Bowman was sentenced to 29 years in prison. Number 4. Anthony Tony Poito. Shortly before noon, one morning in December of 2023, a gunman entered a University of Nevada Business School building on the school's Las Vegas campus and fatally shot 3 faculty members: 64-year-old Professor Cha Jan, Jerry Chang, 39-year-old Assistant Professor Patricia Navarro Velez, and 69-year-old Associate Professor Naoko Takamaru. A 4th victim survived with serious injuries. The gunman died in a shootout with responding officers who rushed to the scene in response to the gunfire. Identified as 67-year-old Anthony Tony Poito, he had recently applied for teaching jobs at several universities in the area and was turned down. He had previously taught at other colleges, including East Carolina University, where he worked for 16 years before resigning in 2017. One of Polito's former students told local station WNCT that the professor had a tendency to ramble about his obsession with Las Vegas, and that he seemed unusually fixated on the few students who left bad reviews about him every year. Another former student described Poito as well-dressed, polite, and mild-mannered, not at all the type of person someone would picture committing a triple murder. Poito had a website where he posted his personal writings, including a piece claiming he had decoded one of the Zodiac Killer's unsolved ciphers. In it, he claimed to be a 35-year member of Mensa and wrote that he had applied for various jobs due to his love of cryptography, but had been turned down by them all. According to police, Polito's ongoing struggles to find work left him in dire financial straits and facing eviction. Shortly before the shooting, he had stopped at a post office and mailed 22 letters to university staff members throughout the US. At least one of the envelopes contained a powdery white substance which was ultimately deemed harmless. The letters described long-held grudges against people from Polito's past and were filled with resentful and bitter statements. In the notes, Poito arrogantly referred to himself as Dr. 160 IQ. While his exact motive for the shooting may never be known, the evidence showed that he had trouble letting go of the past and thought very highly of himself, which most likely added to his frustrations and confusion over his apparent inability to land steady work. Number 3. Michael Lauder. Born in 1963, Michael B. Lauder grew up in New Rochelle, New York, just north of New York City. It was clear from early on in his childhood that he was intellectually gifted, which opened the door to prestigious educational opportunities. In the early 1980s, he graduated a year early from Yale University with 2 majors and summa cum laude honors. It seemed like Lauder was on a path to success, but he began suffering from schizophrenia shortly after he graduated from college. His symptoms started with the paranoid belief that his work phone was being tapped, which ultimately led to him quitting his job as a consultant in 1985. Lauder attempted to pursue a writing career as his symptoms worsened, causing him to believe that his friends were cult members and that his parents had been replaced by neo-Nazi agents. After spending 8 months in a psychiatric hospital, Lauder enrolled in law school at Yale. During his time there, he began dating a woman named Caroline Costello. He graduated with honors in 1992 despite his continued battle with mental illness. But he struggled to land a job after obtaining his law degree. Things began to look up for Lauder after the New York Times featured a story about his experience with mental illness and his decision to go public with his diagnosis. He landed a $600,000 book deal and sold the rights to his story to filmmakers who planned to make a movie about his life. But his schizophrenia continued to interfere with his life and progress on his autobiography stalled. Costello tried her best to support Lauder despite sometimes being the target of his delusions. She was locked out of the couple's apartment more than once due to Lauder's belief that she was an alien imposter, but she had no idea how much worse things were about to get. On a particularly difficult day in June of 1998, Lauder stabbed Costello to death at their home while in the throes of a severe psychotic episode. Officers found her body while performing a welfare check at the request of a concerned relative, and Lauder was found nearly 200 miles away on the Cornell University campus. He was charged with second-degree murder, but the case was dropped after the prosecution accepted his plea of not guilty by reason of mental defect. As of 2024, Lauder remains institutionalized at a state hospital for court-ordered patients in New Hampton, New York. Today's topic was requested by Gloomcrawl 1325 and the guy that plays Universon 9869. If you have any other topics that you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Lyon Chen. While performing a welfare check at the request of a worried friend in January of 2024, police found 27-year-old Google software engineer Xuanyi Yu beaten to death inside her $2.1 million Silicon Valley home. Also present at the scene was her husband, 27-year-old Google software engineer Lyon Chen. The friend who requested the welfare check explained that they had gone over to the couple's house after being unable to reach either of them by phone. Chen wouldn't answer the door, and when the friend peered in through the window, they saw him motionless on his knees and staring blankly with his hands in the air in a seemingly catatonic state. He was covered in blood and one of his fists was severely swollen. Upon arriving at the scene, police took Chen into custody on suspicion of second-degree murder. He remains held without bail amid the ongoing case, and the house he and Yu shared has been listed for sale. Chen and Yu lived at the residence for less than a year leading up to Yu's murder, and neighbors told reporters that the couple were quiet and mostly kept to themselves. For the time being, the circumstances leading up to the horrific act of violence remain a mystery. For those of you who couldn't get enough of your daily dose of They Will Kill You, stay tuned till after number 1 because we've got our previous release of When Bankers Go Wrong coming up shortly for you. Number 1. William Bradford Bishop Jr. 39-year-old U.S. Department of State worker William Bradford Bishop Jr. was last seen at a sporting goods store in Jacksonville, North Carolina, in early March of 1976. A day earlier, he had bludgeoned his wife, mother, and 3 sons to death with a hammer at the family's home in Bethesda, Maryland. The murders occurred shortly after Bishop learned that he had been passed over for a promotion at his job. He had grown frustrated with his seemingly dead-end career, was struggling financially, and unable to pay his mortgage, and was on medication for anxiety. leading to the suspicion that he got rid of his family so he was no longer responsible for supporting them after killing the victims. Bishop drove their bodies to North Carolina, where he buried them in a shallow grave and lit them on fire. The state of Maryland issued a warrant for his arrest for murder, while federal authorities charged him with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. More than 2 weeks later, Bishop's car was found abandoned in Tennessee's Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the town of Elkmont. His fate and whereabouts remain a mystery to this day. Bishop was a skilled outdoorsman who held multiple college degrees, including from Yale University, and spoke 5 languages. He was described by the FBI as highly intelligent as well as intense and self-absorbed and prone to violent outbursts. In 2014, investigators speculated that he may have assumed a new identity, was possibly hiding in plain sight somewhere in the US. If Bishop was still alive at that point, he would have been 86 years old, but the FBI warned the public not to approach him in the event of a sighting and to instead call law enforcement right away. In 2021, an adopted Massachusetts woman named Kathy Gilchrist learned that she was Bishop's biological daughter. She was born before his other children to a different mother and knows nothing about the nature of her parents' relationship. The discovery marked the most shocking development relating to Bishop in recent years, but he still hasn't been found. He would be 96 years old today, making it unlikely that he's still alive, but the FBI continues to follow up on tips and leads in hopes of eventually solving the mystery. Number 8. Zahid Nasim. In May of 2018, friends of British woman Christina Abbotts became concerned when she didn't turn up for her 29th birthday party. Local police went to her residence in Crawley, West Sussex, and used a battering ram to break down her front door. Abbotts' lifeless body was found naked on her bed, and it would later be determined that she'd succumbed to head trauma and manual strangulation. On the couch, the police found a bathrobe-clad man, subsequently identified as 47-year-old banker Zahid Nasim. As shown by body cam footage, he appeared to be unconscious, but a police officer and a paramedic noted that he could have been feigning his condition. He kept up the alleged act for roughly 2.5 hours before he started speaking to law enforcement in the hospital. When asked about Abbotts' death, Nasim claimed he didn't remember anything and told officers, "I'm not some hyper-high-functioning psychopath creating a story for you, a la Silence of the Lambs." An investigation revealed that Abbotts, who told friends and family she was working in IT, had been offering escort services online under the alias Tilly Pexton. She and Nasim had met on several occasions, and they'd been captured by CCTV kissing in a supermarket leading up to Abbotts' death. An examination revealed that at some point during the drug and alcohol-fueled night, she'd been struck in the head 13 times with a kitchen pestle before being fatally strangled. Nasim would eventually admit to have hit her, but claimed it had been in self-defense. He'd allegedly become fearful and overtaken by a red mist in the midst of a consensual game in which Abbotts was strangling him. Multiple defensive wounds on the victim's body contradicted his version of events. He was ultimately found guilty of murder and jailed for at least 19 years. Number 7. Neil Elbec. In November of 2008, millionaire banker Neil Elbec got into an argument with his wife Kate at their home in Enfield, North London. Elbec, then in his mid-40s, had been secretly monitoring his wife's phone calls and reading her texts. He discovered that she'd been having an affair with their son's tennis coach, while also maintaining close relationships with the chef at the Ritz and a childhood sweetheart. Elbec had also reportedly been seeing someone else during the course of their tumultuous 14-year marriage. The HSBC banker knew a divorce was imminent, but was allegedly willing to go to any lengths to prevent it. A row erupted when Kate finally asked that they separate. The argument turned into nearly an hour-long physical altercation, during the course of which Elbec inflicted 43 separate injuries on his wife, 18 of which were to the face. He then went out to pick up their daughter from school, and when the child asked where her mother was, Elbec replied she'd gone shopping. In reality, she'd succumbed to pressure which he'd applied to her neck for a period of 20 seconds to 2 minutes. In the ensuing trial, a jury accepted that Elbec hadn't meant to kill his wife, but he was jailed for 8 years for manslaughter. As of the latest updates on the case, the former banker had been released from prison and he returned to the home in which he'd killed his wife. while reportedly trying to resume his relationship with their teenage son and daughter. Number 6. David Fontana. In March of 2022, a passerby found a mutilated human hand with glitter nail polish on it off a mountain road in Brescia, a province roughly 2 hours outside of Milan, Italy. The authorities were called and over a dozen more body parts were discovered in scattered garbage bags. The remains were confirmed as a woman's, but she couldn't be identified as her face had been burned. The police released a description of her multiple tattoos, several of which were intact. The victim was eventually identified as 26-year-old adult film actress and OnlyFans model Carol Maltese, who performed as Charlotte Angie. During the investigation, the police were approached by banker David Fontana, who lived next door to the victim in Rescaldina. He offered information about her disappearance which directly contradicted what the police had learned. 43-year-old Fontana was arrested as investigators deemed his report suspicious. The authorities searched his home and found a large freezer, the same type of bags used to dispose of Maltese's body, as well as incriminating DNA evidence. Additionally, earlier in March, cameras had captured Fontana driving the victim's car. He ultimately broke down, admitted to have killed her on January the 10th or 11th. He kept paying her rent and used her phone to message those who knew her to maintain the illusion she was still alive. As per Fontana's testimony, he and Maltese had arranged to make 2 adult films together, the second of which was more violent. The woman was handcuffed to a stripper pole naked and with a bag over her head. Fontana then started tapping her legs with a hammer, progressively hitting her harder as he worked his way up. He then forcefully struck her in the head multiple times until she was on the verge of death. "I don't know why I did it," Fontana reportedly told investigators, adding that in an act of kindness, he then removed the bag from Maltese's head and slit her throat with a kitchen knife. He cut her body up and kept it in his freezer, but disposed of the remains upon learning the police was looking for her. Fontana was consequently charged with aggravated first-degree homicide, dismemberment, and concealing a corpse. Number 5. Stephen Irving Saunders. Florida banker Stephen Irving Saunders was arrested by Hillsborough County Police in December of 2021 for punching a female teenager in the face during a road rage incident. The victim had allegedly cut off Saunders' custom Porsche 911 on Florida Avenue North in Tampa. While they were stopped at a red light, the banker got out of the convertible and approached her vehicle, yelling out a barrage of profanities. He then reached into the unnamed victim's open driver's side window and struck her in the jaw with a closed fist. In the investigation that followed, the teenager easily identified his custom-painted Porsche and then recognized Saunders when presented with a picture of his driver's license. He was taken into custody and charged with burglary of a conveyance with assault or battery, which Hillsborough County court systems view as a felony punishable by life. As of the latest information released to the media, Saunders had pleaded not guilty to the charge and was released on a $15,000 bond. Number 4. David Pomfey. Barclays executive David Pomfey was jailed for life, with a minimum of 20 years served after being convicted of murdering his wife, Anne Marie, on November the 2nd of 2018. The banker, then in his early 50s, had attacked the woman at the stables where they kept horses, near their home in Winwick, Cheshire, England. He used a crowbar to strike 49-year-old Anne Marie over 30 times, primarily focusing on her head, as she fruitlessly cowered and tried to defend herself. David then left her to die in a pool of her own blood, cleaned himself up, and disposed of the murder weapon in a pond. While in an apparent distraught state, he called law enforcement and claimed to have found his wife of 22 years with brain and blood everywhere. He maintained the facade of a heartbroken man for months before a key piece of evidence in the form of airborne blood on his socks tied him to the murder. He then changed his story and admitted to killing his wife but denied premeditation, blaming her volatile behavior for what he deemed had been a temporary loss of control on his part. Anne Marie had a number of health issues, which included being on the autism spectrum, as well as having Asperger's syndrome, and she'd recently had treatment for cancer. Her decline in health reportedly took a heavy toll on David, to whom she'd allegedly been verbally and physically abusive for years. As David later told the authorities, she slapped him and called him names when he went to the stables to retrieve some tools. He then snapped and attacked her with the crowbar. During the ensuing trial, David was called an accomplished liar and an accomplished actor by the prosecution, leading up to the pronouncement of his mandatory 20-year sentence. Number 3. Robert S. An investment banker only identified as Robert S. by Swiss authorities was arrested on suspicion of murder in September of 2014. The banker, then in his late 40s, was accused of strangling a high-class escort to death at the 5-star Dolder Grand Hotel near Zurich on September the 16th. He then moved the victim's body, and about a week after the alleged murder, it was found in Robert's home in the town of Kuznacht. It stuffed the remains in a suitcase and kept them in a wine fridge in his cellar. The 25-year-old victim's identity was protected by Swiss privacy laws, but she worked under the aliases Ona, Deborah, and Kathleen. She had trained to become a nurse in her native Poland and kept regular contact with her family, who'd initially raised the alarm about her disappearance. Robert admitted to her killing but denied premeditation, claiming it had occurred in the spur of the moment. He claimed that he and his victim had actually been in a relationship and that she wanted to move in together. As per his account, he decided to remain with his existing partner, and an argument ensued when Kathleen demanded he pay her off. He told the court, "I never intended to kill this woman. I just wanted her to be quiet." Prosecutors argued that for months, the banker had been paying Kathleen for intercourse, and it was he who wanted a relationship with her before committing the murder, fearing rejection. Robert was eventually sentenced to 17 years in prison. Number 2. Sanjay N. On May the 21st of 2016, Sonita Nijawan was found dead at her multi-million-dollar residence in a gated community of Weybridge, England. The woman's husband, 46-year-old Sanjay, had recently quit his high-paying banking job in the City of London while they still had a mortgage of over $800,000. He'd reportedly been depressed for months and suffered a mental breakdown when Sonita told him that she wanted a divorce. Investigators determined that he'd killed his wife by delivering over 120 axe strikes to her head and body. He then slit her throat with a knife before sitting next. Hours before the brutal attack, he'd reportedly Googled ways to end his own life as well as soft parts of a female human skull. Relatives who were aware of tensions between them went to their home after they were unable to reach Sonita on her phone. They discovered the bloody scene upon their arrival and alerted the authorities. Sanjay survived his self-inflicted wounds and a psychiatric evaluation was ordered. A jury ultimately convicted him of manslaughter after accepting that he wasn't in full control of his actions at the time of the horrific killing. He was jailed for a minimum of 9 years and 172 days. Number 1. Rurik P. A Cambridge-educated banker was labeled sadistic and psychopathic by a judge in a Hong Kong court upon being convicted of brutally murdering 2 escorts. Rurik P. had worked for Bank of America Merrill Lynch's London office before moving to its Hong Kong branch in 2013. By that point, his life had reportedly spiraled out of control due to his addiction to violent adult films, drugs, and escort services. On the morning of November the 1st of 2014, he called the police 3 times from his luxurious 1-bedroom apartment at the J residence in Wan Chai, claiming that something happened. 30-year-old Seneng Mujasai, also known as Jessie Lorena, was found by officers clinging to life while lying naked on the floor. The woman, originally from Indonesia, had sustained knife wounds to her neck, throat, and buttocks. She was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. Hong Kong police then discovered the badly decomposed body of 23-year-old Sumati Ningsai, also from Indonesia, stuffed in a black suitcase on the apartment's balcony. Her remains were wrapped in towels while her arms and legs were bound. During the ensuing trial, the jury was shown gruesome photos and videos taken from Jutting's iPhone. In addition to scenes of horrific abuse and violence, they also contained rambling monologues from Jutting, including his self-confession. Ningish, the first victim, had been murdered after 3 days of prolonged torture, carried out at knife point by the banker. After putting her body in the suitcase, he made preparations for a second killing, claiming he wanted to be as inhumane as possible. He found Mujasai and offered her around $250 for intercourse. Upon arriving at the apartment and realizing the danger in which she found herself, the woman began to scream. Jutting threatened her with a knife, but when she continued to struggle, stabbed her to death. The victims' families asked for the death penalty, but Jutting, who had been found to suffer from narcissistic personality disorder, was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be the strongest person on Earth or the smartest person on Earth? Let us know in the comment section below.